the AWS Academy Cloud Architecting Module 9, implementing elasticity and high availability and monitoring. So the architecture need that we have for the cafe is that the cafe will be featured in a famous TV food show. When it airs, the architecture must handle significant increase in capacity. What are the solutions and the options that we can use as a solution architect in order to basically make the cafe architecture highly available and highly scalable? We want to build a reactive architecture. And what we mean by that? Our architecture will be able to respond to an increased demand by adjusting dynamically its capacity, and we call this elastic and scalable. We also want to have an architecture which is resilient, which means it can adapt against changes, and you don't need to have a direct human intervention in order to fix the architecture or to configure it. We want the architecture to be responsive and message driven as well, which means we want the architecture to adapt against the data that it receives in a daily basis. So this is take us to scaling your compute resource. So what we mean by elasticity? An elastic infrastructure can expand and contract as capacity needs changes. So you can increase the number of web servers when the traffic spikes, lowering write capacity in your database when the traffic goes down, and handling the day-to-day fluctuation of demand throughout your architecture. If you look to scaling is a technique that we use to adjust the capacity of our infrastructure dynamically without any human intervention. Normally, we have two types of scaling. We have horizontal scaling. So if we have one web server, so if this is web 1, we want to increase this and we generate multiple instances of the same application, and each application will have, or each instance will have the same software or application to serve customers. So with horizontal scaling, we are just increasing the number horizontally. Each new instance will be able to serve the service that you are trying to provide for your end customer. With vertical scaling, and this is a very famous approach when we do relational database system. With vertical scaling, you have, for example, an RDS with T2 micro, and you want to scale it up and increase the capacity in terms of CPU, RAM, or even disk space. You want to scale it vertically, and you want to change it from T2 micro to T2, for example, small. If T2 small is not enough, you are able also to increase it vertically as well, all the way to T2X large or T2 2X large. Let us look now to the first auto scaling, which is Amazon EC2, where we can launch or terminate instances based on our condition and needs, and they can automatically register new instances with the load balancer, and they can launch those instances in a multi-availability zone. So auto scaling always work inside the same region. It will help you to launch multiple instances in multi-AZ, but not in multi-region. There is multiple scaling options in AWS. The first one is the scheduled one, which is good for predictable workload. If you have a customer and you know his workload, he knows how much customer base he has, he knows the end user, then you can use that kind of a scheduled one. You could simply say, I want to create an EC2 instances every Monday morning. I want to have 4 EC2 instances every Monday morning at 9 a.m. and I want to scale them down every Monday evening at 5 p.m. You could also have, for example, the option to scale your infrastructure in a specific date. So maybe you don't need those EC2 instances every week. You might just need them 7 or 3 days out of 7 days in a week. The second one is called dynamic scaling. With dynamic scaling, we normally have a scaling target, and that monitors the infrastructure. And once your EC2 instances reaches a specific threshold, it will trigger the auto scaling. The last one is predictive. With the predictive, you will have normally a machine learning component built by AWS. It's not going to be built by you. Looking to your data, studying your data for 1 month or 2 months or so on, and based on those data, it can predict how much scalability you need for the next. Maybe there is a next season coming, like St. Patrick's Day. Then normally in that day, you sell a lot of services and goods. In this case, it will scale your infrastructure and make it proactively ready to meet the new. So for example, if you have a customer who's selling only Christmas tree, an auto-scaling policy for him to be scheduled only for the Christmas season, because nobody will buy a Christmas tree outside the Christmas season. So in dynamic scaling policies, we have multiple types. We have the simple scaling, and they normally ask about this in the exam. In single scaling adjustment, you have a new workload, it's a new startup, or sometimes you are dealing with a spiky workload you can't predict. You're creating a machine for people who want to do a dev or a testing of a software. So you will never know how much capacity they need. So you can just create a simple scaling policy. You could also use a step scaling. With the step scaling here, you will do the adjustment depending on the size and the metric that you are monitoring. For example, if you are watching the CPU level, you can say when CPU is greater than 20, add 2. When CPU greater than 60, add 1. When CPU lower than 20, delete 2. When CPU is below 10, then delete 3. With the step scaling, you can make multiple step adjustments. And this is very important to avoid resources thrashing. What you need to do in all cases is to avoid having an auto-scaling that create and launch an EC2 very quickly and terminate the instance very quickly. This results in two things. The infrastructure will not be stable in a stable state. And the second thing, you will find that the persistence of the data is hard to maintain. So to avoid resource thrashing, creating the resources very quickly and deleting the resources also very quickly, whether you do step scaling or you make sure when you watch a specific metric that the event is long enough. So if the CPU level is greater than 60, you want the CPU level to remain at minimum for 5 minutes. Above 60, then you scale up. Specifically when you terminate machines, so when you scale down, you want to make sure that the CPU is below 20% for a long period of time, let's say 10 minutes before you can terminate or you scale down your EC2 instance. The first step to create auto-scaling is to create an auto-scaling group. In an auto-scaling group, you specify the minimum capacity, the maximum, and the desired. Now, my view for the desired, regardless what people really can say in different textbooks and references, is that if I am monitoring the CPU, so this is my CPU level, and I'm saying if the CPU or if the CPU utilization is above 20%, then you need to scale up. So the minimum I have is 2, the maximum is 6. I'm going to keep adding more machines. And this is a simple scaling policy with auto-scaling group. Now, when the CPU reaches 60% utilization, I'm going also to scale again and add more EC2 instances. Now, I said also, if the CPU below 20, I'm going to scale down. Now, what if the CPU is in between 20% utilization and 60% utilization? In this particular scenario, you could maintain the desired capacity. When everything is working normally, there is no up in the CPU utilization or down metrics of the CPU utilization, then I would love to maintain the desired capacity. With auto-scaling, you can create a multiple on-demand and reserved instance. And the magic formula and also spot instance, you can also make participation from multiple different types of EC2. I prefer normally to have 80% of my capacity via reserved instances. So the capacity needs will be met by 80% of a reserved instances. Let's say I need 10 EC2 instances at maximum, okay? And then I will leave 20% for on-demand, which means every time I got a spike and a predictable capacity needs, I could create an on-demand. Or I could create, instead of 20% on-demand, I could leave it up to 10, 20% here, and 70% on reserve instance. This will make a better scalability options, and also it will make my capacity needs cost optimized. So I can make the same thing. I could reach high level of scalability, and I also reach a high level of cost optimization. A few things to consider when you do auto scaling. Multiple types of automatic scaling scaling and you fusion them or hybrid them together, and you have to use or look to use symbol or step or targeted tracking scaling, where you can have multiple metrics or multiple matrices instead of having only the CPU, and decide when to scale out and to scale in. And maybe you better use life cycle hooks with integration of auto scaling with simple notification service or simple email service that can tell you that your instances are scaling up, so you can understand the behavior of your system and you reach a convergence state. So we look now to create a scaling policy for Amazon EC2 auto scaling. Another thing is to scale your DB. Now